Hello, everyone. It's so great to see you here. I'm already starting to see people coming into the room and saying hello, and I'm recognizing lots and lots of names. So it's really fantastic to have you back again. We're going to start now. People will be trickling in, and that's absolutely fine. I would like to ask you to say hello in the chat and just let me know and let everyone know where you're joining from. We've got people coming in from London and from Hanover, from Hochzollern in Lower Saxony. So please let us know where you're from. It's really great to see you here and welcome. We're going to be talking today about our latest report that has come out, which is really considering a topic that all of us share in this community. All of us working on learning and development and working on professional growth for our audiences. So I'd like to share with you some of the findings of this latest report. It's research that we've conducted with learning leaders from our community, just like you around the world. And thank you if you participated in the research survey. But beyond the data, I would also like to explore some implications or considerations. You know, data gives us a picture, but we also want to consider what to do with that information. So good morning from Essen, hello from Dublin. I'm joining you from Bangkok. So I feel for everybody who's in the cold winter at the moment. We're not in the cold winter. It's a good sunny 34 degrees here in the afternoon in Thailand. I live between the two places and I can say a bit more about that later, but I think that, you know, just as a way of introduction, I'm part of HALT EF Corporate Education. I've been with the organization of EF for over 24 years now, and we've joined forces with HALT Ashridge Executive Education and come together to provide a much wider suite of learning experiences. And so I'm part of the team with HALT EF Corporate Education, and I'm also an adjunct faculty member with Ashridge. So it's from both perspectives that I'm here to share information with you that we've been researching about what is so important to consider right now in how we design and think about learning. I mentioned before that HALT EF and Ashridge came together last year, and we have a focus on these particular areas, on assessment, on the foundations of business, organizational development, language and communication, executive education, and coaching. So there's rather comprehensive potential to look at learning needs from a diverse range of contexts, different stages of career maturity. And so this is really relevant right now as we start to think about where are we now and what do we need to be doing to be thinking about work today. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and to see so many people joining from around the world. And I think back to where we were just shy of 2 years ago when the pandemic hit. We went from business as usual to suddenly the world stopped and time stood still. And we all had to think for a moment, like, how do we navigate this kind of crisis and situation? And one of the webinars I did at the time, which was just in March of 2020, was about leading in a crisis and the importance of strategic communication and clear messaging. And we saw this evolution of the landscape of training, the landscape of digital transformation, just accelerating so fast. And yet everybody also a little bit shell-shocked. You know, how do we deal with so many changes and so many new pressures on us to think about work in a new way, to think about talent development in a new way? And this is about more than just, you know, what do you need to be a leader? It's about how are you investing, you in your positions? How are you investing in training? How are you thinking strategically about what we know now that we didn't know then? You know, what has changed about the way you design learning and you design the learning culture? And so see, these are some of the questions that I invite you to explore today. And I always enjoy having a very participatory session. There are lots of you, there's over 100 of you in the room, but that doesn't stop us from sharing. So along the way, please let us know what's on your mind. What are you experiencing? Because we all benefit from different perspectives and different sharing. So acceleration. is really the theme of what has changed so much in the last couple of years, accelerating our knowledge about the potential of digital training, our ability to think about what gets automated and what doesn't, our acceleration in the science of learning. So many things are moving us forward to make different kinds of decisions about what's important. And what we know now, as we move into a much more digital future and a much more automated future, the things that are going to help us lead and navigate that are the most human skills. So the more digital we get, the more we need to rely on and develop those human capabilities that make us unique. And what we're looking at now, and I imagine many of you share, is a renewed focus and interest on human capability and human potential. Yes, balanced with technical competence, but really thinking about what is it that's going to help us take in information, uncertain information, incomplete information, and be able to lead global teams, be able to deliver on strategies. And that really has us thinking about how we relate, the relational skills. How do we work across borders and across cultures? How do we develop our emotional intelligence, our personal resilience? And how do we be more inclusive? And inclusion is complicated because inclusion involves so many dimensions of understanding and recognizing different challenges, gaps, interest profiles in ways that we had not always considered. So we have a big challenge ahead of us. And so much of it begins with trust and relationship building and creating the conditions for people to be able to learn and to grow. So it's in this context that we launched this research last year. We wanted to figure out what is going on for all of you. Let's get some evidence behind the conversations that we're hearing. We see lots of media, we see blogs, we see lots of reports. So let's just get some insight that we can start to build on. What are the most important skills for you right now as you look ahead? And understand how that's been changing, because things have changed over the last 2 years, over the last 5 years, and going ahead, you can predict how these changes are going to take shape. And so, this has an impact on how we recruit and develop. So what are the challenges that you're facing? The research itself that we'll be looking at today comes from people like us, comes from people who are in leadership and development and learning and development capacities. Senior people, many of you who have been working across many geographies, working on designing blended, complicated major projects. So, we've talked to approximately 1,200, it's 1188, so nearly 1,200, knocking on 1,200, with the presence of employees in over 3 countries, more than 1,000 staff. So it's a pretty interesting population. It's quite large organization. So there would be obviously different implications for those working in smaller organizations and maybe in different kinds of geographical spreads or even regional spreads or internally domestically. But this gives you a flavor for the type of data that we're working with. And the sectors that were sampled covered finance, insurance, accounting, technology, software, and manufacturing in these different countries. So that's the context. We're looking at the challenges you're facing and what has been shifting over time. And once we look through that, I'd like to also start to consider what is that going to do about how we design learning and create a learning culture. So at any point, of course, we want to hear from you how this is affecting you. And if you're not represented in any of this kind of sample, then what perspectives could you also offer to help all of us? So let's start off with the dashboard of what exactly is this skills gap that we're talking about and where is it showing up most? So in looking at the landscape of training and recruitment, one of the first things that we looked at was the difficulty of finding workers. And if you look here, this is the spread of how people were considering in 2 years on from the pandemic hitting. So we're in the middle of this great resignation, people call it, where people are reevaluating their choices, they're reevaluating their pathways, and some people are choosing to do very different things. So in that context of change and reflection, we are seeing a skill shortage, and it's showing up in this way with the Nordics and the UK actually showing the most acute, along with China, the most acute problem. in terms of time to fill positions. Is it taking longer, the same, or how are you doing with that? And again, similar pattern with the Nordics, China, and the UK, reflecting that it's actually taking longer to find people. And of course, thinking ahead, what can you predict? And what do you think in your own, from where you sit and what you see? Do you think this is actually harder now, that it's going to be harder to recruit skilled workers into the future? And then thinking about your own individual industry sectors. So again, you start to see some patterns where Argentina seems to feel less of the pressure, whereas the UK, the Nordics, China, France, to some extent, Italy as well, you're starting to see more pressure. And that pressure is going to have implications for the types of decisions we make and how we decide to retain people. What mechanisms do we put in place to both develop and hold on to our best talent? So it's an interesting way to kind of think about the world picture and where is the problem most acute. One of the key findings that was shared with us was that there's a shift going on between the content of the training itself. And I'm curious if this is something that you perceive as well. 40%, over 40%, said that their need for soft skills has increased, and that's going to continue. So the budget is shifting. And you'll see out there, a lot of discussion around, soft skills being the wrong word because it undermines what they contribute to the workplace of today and tomorrow. Some people call them power skills. There's different ways to think about this. And, but in terms of how you're allocating your own effort, do you see a shift from moving from soft skills to hard skills? And this is what people were telling us, that we're seeing from 2 years ago to now and 2 years from now, you can see that the soft skills, power skills, human skills are now starting to take up more and more of the share of time and attention. And this is interesting because we have to balance these human skills development with technical knowledge because the world is more digital and more automated, and we have to have the technical literacy to be able to manage what we're doing, manage our shared digital work. So it's a combination of both types of skills. So digging a little more into how professional development has changed over the past 2 years, this is what everyone told us, that yes, more development is being done virtually. Nearly half of people said they've shifted. And we working a lot with organizations around the world on both physical training and blended training and purely virtual training, we've definitely seen that shift. And I've worked and had many conversations with organizations who really quickly had a wake-up call because they had been doing everything face-to-face and they needed to figure out how to bring people together across one country or across several countries. And in particular, we saw that this was a real rapid change in continental Europe, Germany, France, Italy, many markets where people had been used to a physical trainer in a physical space. And whereas you had other countries, maybe because of widespread geography or the organization's own footprint around the world, they were very used to digital training. But overall, we see this shift towards more virtual delivery. And we see it moving more into human soft skills, power skills, if you want to call it that. So, only 7% say nothing's really changed. So they're getting a little bit left behind, or they were just very, very prescient, forward thinking way back when. But the rest of the landscape is really having a great shift. I agree. Nick says that soft skills may not be the right way to do it, but power skills also rings a little strange, I think. So haven't quite worked out what the term. I tend to think human skills, but it could be relational skills. That might be one way to think about it. I'll throw out relational, or interpersonal, but I would love for you to consider this because it does go beyond the social. It's also a little bit about critical thinking and problem solving. So there's something there about cognitive and emotional skills. Executive functioning skills are interpersonal. That's another great way to think about it. Okay, so now we're on the topic of skills. So I've got a poll for you. Just want to get a snapshot of what you think is the most critical skill right now for business success. Now you could rank these and have different priorities, but just pick one. So the poll is open now, and just let us know what you think the most critical skill is, in your opinion, for business success. Just over half of you now have answered. Thank you for your quick participation. Wow, almost 80% of you have already answered. Okay, wow, that's a great return rate for 91%. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll there, and just to show you where we landed. Sharing the results now, I hope. Okay, so interesting. So we see that the majority answered leadership, 30%, and then second in line was communication at 26%, digital transformation. So all three go hand in hand, don't they? Because we're talking about these interpersonal, cognitive, executive functioning skills. And thank you for contributing executive functioning. I think that's a great one that came from Holly. And you need the technical know-how. You know, we can't escape that. And then of course you've got problem solving and strategic decision making. So I'm going to stop sharing there because I also want to just share what the survey found. I think you may have seen some of the content that teased out before this webinar that leadership was front and center. That was the skill that everyone said was going to be the most critical, but communication second in line. So everything you just said completely echoes what the survey results say. And I'm not surprised because many of you probably participated in this research. So, but look here, this is a longer tail of answers. So, you know, around project management, data analytics, and so forth. These are the skills that were named as being essential for success today. Would you add anything else differently here? Would you add something, is something missing? You know, for example, something around the relational skills or coaching skills, interpersonal skills, I think ought to be in there myself. You know, there are other things, cross-cultural awareness, intercultural communication, I think is missing here. So I would also put that learning agility. Thank you. Great contribution. Consulting, listening, managing change. If you're following the chat, people are putting different skills in there. Reflection, that's a fantastic way. I want to contribute. Cloud fluency also. Again, it's know-how, it's skills, it's capabilities. So this gives us a sense, though, that we're still very much focused in this zone of human development, personal growth. So let's look at another one of the main challenges that are the main findings. So top two challenges in developing staff across multiple geographies. We're finding programs that were consistent. So what you get in France is what you get in China, is what you get in New Zealand. And it's also suitable across cultures, and that's massively challenging. And so those of you working in international organizations, please share, you know, and Sylvia, I agree, leadership is huge. What is it? And that probably does capture these skills that are also being mentioned in the chat around coaching and reflection and so on. So the sub skills. So thinking about the cross-cultural lens then, what's going on in all these different countries? So one of the things that we asked about was, you know, what's on offer? You know, how much in general are you offering staff beyond the base level of training and their onboarding and induction? And we looked at this from a geographical perspective, and we wanted to understand, is this something that's happening differently in different countries? So first of all, we are seeing that the overwhelming majority of organizations do offer additional learning to beyond the standard onboarding and induction for the role. But then you also see an interesting spread. So in a country like Brazil, for example, 78% of the organizations in Brazil reported that they're offering additional learning. And in Japan, it was quite low. It was the lowest one of the group at just 29%. So something to think about. How consistent is the offer? If you're a global company and you have operations in Brazil and in Japan, how is your training offer perceived? How much is actually available to the staff? And is this equal provision around the world? So there's also a question to consider around the way that learning is being provided. And is it stable and consistent and transparently available globally? Let's also consider what was considered most challenging. So here you have a summary of the biggest challenges people named. And once again, I invite you to share, do you recognize this, or do you see things that are missing here, or would you reprioritize them in different ways? So we have a contribution from Aaron, who says that he agreed with the spread and that he operates in 67 countries. That is a massive. We have a similar kind of spread. We operate in about 115 countries and globally. And so there is always a question of how do you provide consistent training that's available to everyone? So thank you for that, Aaron. So looking at this spread of answers, the top two, really the top four: consistency across geography, suitable across cultures, transferable across geographies. Does it work? If it works in Argentina, does it work in South Sudan? And thinking about your provision, your suppliers, and how do you deal with hundreds of suppliers, or how do you work with one but have a consistent approach around the world and support around the world? And again, only 7% had no problem. So they either had a crystal ball or possibly a bit of denial. This has to be something everyone's facing around the world. The fact of the cross-cultural angle is one I'm particularly interested in, because that's my main area of work. And I think a lot about how we deal with intercultural communication. How do we encourage participation from people of different locations, cultural backgrounds? And language, of course, is a massive driver of this, because language itself, the corporate language that you adopt, whether it's Spanish or Mandarin or Arabic, English, that the ability to use that language should not be a barrier to professional development and talent progression. So how do we make sure that we're encouraging and enabling access to training programs if there is a corporate language that is dominant? So how do we make sure that that's also possible? So some interesting insight there. And again, I invite you to share anything that you may think is perhaps missing, that we might be missing out on. Okay, another key finding. This is about the challenge for recruitment. And 63% believe that it's going to be more difficult to recruit skilled workers in the future. And so the implication is you need to really focus on who you've got as well, and try to make sure that you're encouraging upskilling and professional development. Many of you may have heard of the phrase, the 60-year curriculum. And that came from the former dean of Harvard's extension school, their division of continuing education. And he makes this point about the 60-year curriculum simply being that what we learned in our formal education, what you may have learned in vocational or higher education, only gets you so far. And we're seeing this radical transformation all the time of the world of work. So we need to have a much longer time horizon for how we learn and how we train. So a 60-year curriculum may fill you with horror at the sound of it, but if you love learning, it's wonderful news. But we do have to have a much longer time horizon for how we think about things. And that's where the upskilling comes in the sense that we have to plan for an open-ended future. We just don't know what the destination is. We don't know what the jobs are that people will be having in a very short time because of the changes we always see. So how do we build that kind of flexibility into what we design and deliver? So another poll for you. So this time, just want you to consider this question around the challenges of recruitment. So how difficult is it in your organization, from your perspective, to recruit senior staff? Now I'm focused on senior staff here with the right skills. Just give you a moment to do that. Okay, so 2/3 of you have come through. We'll just a few more. And while I'm looking at that, I'm looking at the chat as well and saying thank you so much for your contributions there. Talking about intentional learning and social learning on the job. So I invite everyone to check out the chat because there's good contributions going there, talking about how we're approaching this. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish up. We got 80% of you on that one. So we're going to share the results. So looking at how difficult it is to recruit senior staff with the necessary skills. So bringing somebody in who's got what you need right away. And we're looking at moderately difficult and extremely difficult. Okay, so that's 94, is that right? 93% of you say moderate to extremely difficult. So, you know, there is a challenge out there. It seems that you're also experiencing this. Why is that? What can you share in the chat with us from your perspective? Why is it so difficult to find the people who have what you need coming in the door? Where is this challenge coming from? Would love to hear your perspectives on that. I'll go ahead and stop sharing that poll. Right. So this is what we found in the data. So considering how difficult it is to recruit senior staff, and this changes with company size, but 60% we're saying was moderately difficult to extremely difficult. So your results are even more striking because you were up to almost 93% or so in that same bunch. But many of you are probably working in quite distributed large organizations. We already heard from somebody in over 67 territories. So this can pose a very big challenge. And it's very few people, 5%, who say it's easy and 12% say it's very easy. So, you know, this needs to be on our radar, thinking about what is the skill set that people bring to us, and, you know, what is it that we need to develop internally as well to allow these pathways for progression. What are the most important skills when we think about seniority and all the different types of things that we're talking about, the different categories of skills we could be learning? So here, you know, you're looking at different types of skills and their relative importance by the seniority. So if you think about the senior skills, okay, so the dark green, the top two senior skills identified that were most important were leadership, again, and strategic decision-making. And leadership, I agree with Sylvia, I believe it was, who said earlier, is really wide. You know, it's a quite broad category, but this is flagged up both leadership and strategic decision-making. Experienced staff, sort of at that level, indeterminate level, again, leadership and problem solving. And for junior staff, communication and technical skills. So it would be interesting to know if this also resonates with you, if this is kind of information that you're also quite familiar with. And then looking ahead, what's going to be most in demand? So we've established where some of the gaps are, but let's think about what's going to be in demand. In the orange color is there's an observed increase over the past 2 years. And the lighter color is the expected increase over the next 5 years. So just take a look through that. Digital transformation surges at the top and will continue to be important over the next 5 years. The real wake-up call of the pandemic, you know, kind of forced our hand. You know, we really had to confront this and think about what does digital transformation look like? Because we've all been transforming digitally for decades, but you know, now we see that there's entirely new possibilities within digital transformation for reaching a much wider audience from a learning point of view. The potential is fantastic, what we can do when we start to bring in technology to really fundamentally change the way that we teach and reach people. Then we have working remotely, virtual presence, leading virtual teams, and someone asked the question around virtual presence. Virtual presence is the communication skills, but doing it through this box. So how you project yourself, it's both body language, it's voice, presentational skills, organizational skills. It's how to navigate facilitation. There's a bit of, you know, active participation, active listening. How do you do that through the box? That's virtual presence. So you can see there's quite a lot of digital related context here. Virtual presence, leading virtual teams, digital literacy, programming and AI. So this is where we really see this convergence of the human skills and the digital skills. And it makes perfect sense because, we are working now in what has been termed shared digital spaces. We don't have the physical space we all go to anymore. And we have our private digital spaces that we exist in through apps and social media and that kind of presence. But now we have shared digital spaces that we all need to come together in, establish an identity, build relationships, and deliver on our objectives and according to a vision that's been set out for us. So there's a lot of digital in there. Do you agree with this line? And would you say anything is missing? I'm going to always champion, and it might be a bit in here with some of the leadership, but I'm always going to champion having the diversity and inclusion and cultural perspective here, because the more digital we get, the boundaries might be physically erased, but there's a lot of invisible layers to how we interact and relate to each other. Right, so this brings me then to thinking about the so what. For me as an instructional designer, my work has always been about trying to think about who the learner is, what is the outcome that we're looking for, and then how creative can we be? How do we bring different tools and techniques and approaches into designing learning experiences? So for those of you who are responsible for learning design and creating learning culture in organizations, what does this data tell us? What are the things that come to mind? And I can see in the chat that there's some really great contributions here around this relationship building in a virtual world. And that's one of the things that really is front and center. It's relationship building. And I mentioned before that we're upskilling, but to where's the destination? It's a very open-ended future. And there's lots of perspectives out there about the content of learning and trying to provide a world of endless menus of content and endless pathways. But how do you create that when you don't know what the end goal is going to be? So I always think about trying to cut through the noise and think about what are the principles that we need to be thinking about. And that will help guide us as a compass as we make strategic decisions about learning design. And when I consider this data and I think about what is it telling me and what do we need to keep in mind, I want to share with you some of the considerations that I think, and I would love for you to contribute what it makes you think as well. First off, I think about learning design and culture, because we can always change the tools. The technology is always going to change. Digital transformation, as I mentioned, is that was a big deal to go from CD-ROMs, into DVDs. So digital transformation happens a lot, and for learning, the way we move into the online space and so on. But, what's guiding how we approach it and how we bring people into it? And this mixture that we have now around physical and digital, I think is really meaningful because it gives us a chance to think about the learners from a very holistic point of view, really thinking about personal and professional development. Our worlds are so blended now. And, really thinking about mindset and thinking about interpersonal and relational skills, as well as the technical know-how. So trying to really think about from a quite broad perspective, who is the whole person that we are designing learning for and why? And taking it from this angle of the human development, we have an opportunity then to really focus on people's abilities and capabilities for the future, to think about challenge, think about influence, drive, uniquely human things that are how people experience us. If you think about presence, you think about impact, this is where it comes from. It's how you influence people. It's how you show up and how people experience you. So designing learning that helps people reflect on who they are, what kind of leader they are, building those skills for reflection will be able to help people have an awareness of how they're working together. And that awareness can lead to so many positive moments for growth. But then we have to also think about how we're doing it. If we have shared digital spaces, we're working in blended environments, we're working in purely digital environments, what do teams need? And there is a call out there for reminding ourselves that however you work, wherever you work, however flexibly, You have to have psychological safety to be able to trust each other in teams when you're not, especially when you're not together. It's just as important when you are together. But how do you build the technical skills, the presence skills, the interpersonal skills, and develop trust in teams? So this needs to be considered for how we set out a learning agenda. When we're trying to launch strategic initiatives around learning, are we considering all of these elements that go into how people are going to connect with us? Because they could be someone who's very part-time, very flexible, or someone who's very permanent, but in a very hard to reach location. So you have a lot of different variables there. And as I've mentioned before, we've always got to be mindful of the inclusion dimension. There's all kinds of diversity out there. It's a fact of our lives. A lot of it we can't see. And there's a lot of cultural perspectives that inform how we behave and what we expect of each other. And so being able to think about how people perceive the learning offer, what is expected of them, what is the role of hierarchy and authority in this, can be very culturally driven. What is the nature of credibility and respect, that can be culturally driven. So trying to really think about, what are we offering to people and how can we lower any barriers to participation? And doing that grounded through principles. So I see, as all of you do, how much innovation there is in learning and how many different types of tools there are. And, there's great potential in the technology. We shouldn't be distracted by technology either. I've always believed that we need to make learner-centered decisions, and learner-centered decision-making means considering what are the needs, what's the context, what are the outcomes, what's the possibilities, and then choosing the right tools rather than making technology-centered decisions. And I've estimates, and I've worked with a number of companies and sat in conversations with organizations where they went the technology-centered way first. And then this means that you end up fitting your learning design into a technology that may or may not be suitable, may not even be necessary. So when I'm talking about, someone's asked a question, Suzanne's asked about the solid principles, what I'm talking about, and I'm going to talk about these in a moment, is thinking about the science of learning and the psychology of learning. What is it that we can be fairly sure of that works in learning, whether you're working with adults, whether you're working with children, there's different principles that may apply of how you design learning. And that's what I'm talking about, using principles to help guide decision-making for what kinds of experiences that you may create. And the first thing I do is I want to go straight to the science and follow the science, because as much as technology is accelerating and changing what we can do through automation and AI and virtual reality, augmented reality, and so on, in the background, there's also massive advances in the neuroscience and the science of learning and the psychology of learning. And we're only scratching the surface, but this is such an exciting space to watch. We've been involved in different neuroscience research projects at university level, just trying to understand some of the differences of how people recall information in another language based on different contextual or environmental experiences. But if you see what we can do now through learning science that we couldn't do 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So it's an exciting space to be working in. And one of the key things that is being revealed more and so over time is just the important role of emotions as a driver of effective learning, that you learn best in the presence of emotions, of your own emotions. So how do we stimulate emotions that activate parts of your brain, the limbic system, that help you recall information better? And the good news for adults is that more and more research on neuroplasticity is emerging, which simply says your brain can change. You can keep changing, you can keep learning well into your adulthood. And it starts to put away some of the myths that you're too old to do certain things. And there's more and more evidence that it isn't just a critical period for children to be able to learn certain skills or language skills and so on. Neuroplasticity is very encouraging because it means that we do have opportunities to keep learning and changing. And we can apply that idea with adult learners in both digital and physical environments, because we need to create the links between cognition, what's going on and how we think and analyze, and emotion and how we process things and respond to things. So you can create learning experiences that activate knowledge and activate emotion for better learning. And just three quick examples is just more and more insight coming through about the role of memory and emotion in memory, and how we have different areas of our brain, different systems in the brain that tap into different types of memory. And the more we can maybe think about what are the types of activities, learning experiences that help to build and create knowledge and add on to knowledge, we have a chance of doing it more effectively. So for example, procedural memory is really about how you remember the sequence of events of things. And this is stored and recalled in slightly different ways than prospective memory, which is a memory for how you plan and anticipate and project into the future. And episodic memory, which is more about events and how you interact and relate in the memory of experiences. And these, focusing on different types of memory, different types of activities, allows us to do our instructional design differently. And so then I come back to this idea of principles. And for me, you know, I think a lot about what do we know that we can be reasonably sure appears to work, because that's sort of the good enough conditions to try to build on better learning experiences. And knowing that adults can thrive and keep learning and keep adding to their knowledge, and knowing that emotion plays a role in this, then we might want to go back to the original principles of adult learning and think what can we add to that? How is that enhanced? One of the key ones is understanding the nature of self-direction and autonomy. Adults are self-directed, so involving an adult in the anticipating what's next, or involving an adult in making a choice about what they're going to do, is considered to be almost as impactful as the outcome of that experience. So just involving people in choice engages adult learners because they have a sense of responsibility and anticipation. Adults also need each other, and they learn best in the presence of another. And everything we're talking about, these human skills, these interpersonal skills, you don't learn those on your own. You learn them with others in the presence of another. This isn't a self-taught and isolation experience. You need to actually work with others and understand the dynamics of relationships. So creating learning experiences that give adults choice, give them a little bit of a chance to anticipate and interact with decisions, giving adults a chance to work together and measure and test out their own hypotheses with each other, can create powerful learning. Adults also need relevance. They need to know why they're being tasked with something, and they need to understand how it can apply to what they're currently doing. And I think all of us can probably relate to this. But what's interesting about neuroplasticity and the way that you create knowledge, this has to do with awakening past knowledge. So recalling what you already know because you have an existing structure. Through all of your neuronal structure, you have a structure for knowledge. And if you activate that you can then build onto it. And that's where neuroplasticity comes in. And it's in the moment, real time, changing circumstances, using something is how you can better build knowledge onto existing information. So a very simple way to do that in learning tasks is just simply to ask somebody, what does that look like? Have you experienced this before? Activate past knowledge, and then you can start to build onto it. So situations, if you're thinking about team dynamics, leadership puzzles and challenges, get people to think about where they have been before with this. What do they recognize? And that starts to create the conditions to be able to build on that and shape based on changing circumstances. And the last one is echoing what I was saying about emotion, that we also understand that adults learn through emotion and experience. By combining the two, we create the better chances for recall. So reflecting, building good skills for reflection, not only builds self-awareness, which helps with your impact and your empathy with others and rapport building, but it also helps you learn. Because again, you're building on past experience And if you add just a bit of social pressure in interactions, perhaps that the anxiety that comes from giving a presentation or speaking for others, but in that moderate conditions of stress, that actually enhances emotion, which enhances the chance for recall as well. So learning shouldn't be a passive individual experience, but involving people slightly out of their comfort zone creates the conditions for better learning. And so you can see how taken together, these principles can help you make decisions, and they help me make decisions about how do we create learning experiences that build knowledge, build know-how, but also then bring it into a social domain so that people are learning together and they're learning something that's relevant. I would love to know how you respond to this and whether you also have particular principles that are your go-to principles there. So feel free to let us know in the chat. I know Holly said that she finds it very helpful on the self-direction and the relevance aspect, but it's challenging. And getting people to develop skills for critical reflection is challenging, but it's, I believe, so worth it. And when we talk about working in a very uncertain environment for the future, it's being able to be reflective and apply knowledge in new ways is how we're going to grow and develop. So that really brings me to the last conclusions and recommendations, which I think really just touch upon some of the themes that we've been saying here. And Jürgen has suggested that experience-based learning is crucial, and I completely agree. And what we're seeing now as we start to move into much more digital training, more blended training, is that you can have experiential learning, and it can still be virtual, it can still be online. You just have to think about it in different ways. Think about what's the nature of the interaction you're going to facilitate. And so, thinking about what this data has highlighted, and I wanted to share with you some of the things I go through when I think about designing and learning. The takeaways here are really just about, for me, what do we do to create a culture of learning that can focus on the know-how we need, the technical literacy that we need, but the relational skills and cognitive skills that we need to anticipate what's coming and to manage the uncertainty of the world of work that we've all entered into. And yes, there's a cultural dimension to this. Yes, there's an inclusion dimension to this. And of course, you do want to think about the impact and how do you measure that? So how do you measure someone's ability to be reflective? So there's going to be new ways we have to think about training impact and assessment, because now we're going deep. We're going to something quite introspective when we design learning experiences that are focused on these human developmental skills. So that brings us to the end of sharing this information. And I want to see if we have any questions. There is a Q&A box, so you can submit a question. We have a few that have been submitted already. If you would like to submit a question, try to answer it, or please continue to share in the chat. What I will do though is I will go to the questions first. Okay, right. So someone's asked, you talked about the impact on cultural diversity. Could you talk a little more about that? Thanks. Those of you who are working in multinational organizations will be quite aware that what you put out there may not be perceived in the same way, appreciated in the same way, taken up in the same way, or followed up in the same way. And one of the things that's so crucial is to build a knowledge base as a learning designer and leader of learning, to build your own knowledge base around how do people perceive learning, hierarchy, and authority in different countries. What is the responsibility in that culture for someone to be a learner and to learn the skills they need? Because not every culture around the world has the same idea around self-direction or autonomy. It's a very European idea in many ways of people owning their own progress and owning their own career path. You may find in other culture expectations reversed, that there should be a sponsor of learning who is looking after the needs of people and suggesting mentoring and facilitating people through. And that would be the more expected mode. So you also think about Confucian relationships in several East Asian countries, where again, you have a certain dynamic where following certain steps will be done as long as there's also consideration for looking after as a sponsor. So there's hierarchy, there's power distance questions, there's cultural preferences, and there's the issue of blind spots. And it's one of the things that I think we see most often working with international organizations who have a headquarters, especially in a country where the language, maybe it's English, or they're very good English speakers, in Scandinavia, for example, where there's a lot of blind spots around assuming that the cultural vision, their good intent around the world will be understood. And that's not necessarily always the case. And so trying to address some of those gaps in understanding the cultural preferences can make a difference on the impact of the programs and just involving people more. Thank you. Another question. Is this really just about senior leadership, or does this apply to leaders at all levels? It's really, we've looked at some questions around crucial skills for senior leadership, but honestly, this is really across the board, because we need to be looking at the full life cycle of a professional life. If we're going to be reinventing ourselves, we have to think about career maturity and where are we at different stages, and what are the different needs for reinvention that we have. So no, it isn't just about senior leadership. And in fact, working in virtual teams today means engaging with people around the world from lots of different places on lots of different topics, and hierarchy is a lot less visible. Another question. So someone asks, I work in an international organization, so we recruit English speakers already, but we find they don't participate in being provided for upskilling. Do you have any advice? Great point. It's not enough to be fluent in a language to be able to fully participate in what an organization offers. Language, as I mentioned before, language skills really shouldn't be an obstacle. It shouldn't be a barrier to career progression. So sometimes this is a matter of what is the strategy around language in an organization? To what extent are people encouraged and supported to actually use the common language, whatever it is? But there's also research that's quite fascinating around foreign language anxiety. People feeling uncomfortable using a language because they don't have all the idioms, the slang, the jargon, or the confidence to participate. And there's consequences of that. So somebody may score well on English exams, but if there's anxiety there, and it occurs in teams and in wide organizations, you see the consequence of avoidance, communication avoidance, and people participate less, show up less, contribute less. And they also may start switching languages between a local language and English and another language, which actually makes it more exclusive. It's harder for other people to follow, and that creates small tribes of bilingual usage in a language. The consequence is less sharing, less innovation, less participation. And you also see that this can damage relationships, it impairs relationships. So not being confident about language can have a chain of knock-on effects that actually impacts innovation and participation. So again, it's this, language can be a driver for inclusion if people are supported to do that. Okay, thank you. I'm just looking at the clock. I'm mindful of time. We have another question. To what extent should skills be standardized? Gosh, I don't know. I think this will really depend on your organization and what are the target profiles for particular skills and know-how, because people will have different pathways. And as they move up or move around in an organization, they may need a different knowledge base, different skill base. So that's really going to be quite dependent on the context. Although I think some of these fundamental skills that could be standardized, at least in the approach or provision, would be around critical thinking and reflection, because you can't go wrong with that. And that will serve you at any stage of career maturity. Okay, we have a question. How to support self-directed learning to avoid a situation that urgent topic and priorities will not consume the time for learning? Aha, that's a really good question. And it's tough, because that is part of the culture of learning. It's part of the inclusive aspect of learning, is appreciating people's life circumstances, appreciating the priorities. So where do you make the space for learning? And again, that's be very context dependent. but it is something where we have to take bold decisions to be able to make the space for learning and to be able to allow people to carve out the time and respect that time. And also respect the fact that life happens and priorities do come up. But flexibility is something that will be key there. Great question. This assumes that the learner wants to develop, which I think is a really good point. People don't always tell you what they need, even when they're asked or encouraged. That's where I would pick up on a point. I would just notice that and say, what is holding people back? If you perceive them to be holding back about telling what they want or need. And this can be very much a cultural question, as I was saying before, about the nature of hierarchy and power distance. Some people may feel it's entirely inappropriate for them to tell you what they want or need, and they may be very confused why you are not telling them what they should be doing, because then they would know clearly what's expected. So sometimes there is a cultural dimension to this, and sometimes it might just be a personal preference where they feel this person feels like they have enough of what they need now. And then of course you want to have a conversation about, well, what do they envision for the future? But I think culture can play a big role in that. Okay, I'm going to take one last question. I'm sorry, we're just coming up against time. Okay, we find it challenging to apply adult learning principles to learning when we need to be prescriptive for hard skills or product knowledge. This can't really be self-directed, and we can't involve learners of choices. When a lot of training is in this area, how do you do it without being prescriptive? This is a great question, because quite often there is a curriculum to get through. There's a skill set, of knowledge base you need to get through. So applying the principles then is about articulating why this is necessary and how they're going to use it tomorrow. Where is the relevance in the application? I would lead with application first. And then the self-direction aspect is about within that knowledge base. Where can they make choices to anticipate what's going to come next? Where can you provide just a little bit of agency? Because this really is about agency when we talk about self-direction. Where can you give some choice there? And then on the emotional aspect of it and the experiential aspect, where are you building in moments of reflection and sharing between people who are participating in this, and how are they taking on board this information? So I think you can create social moments. I think you can create moments of agency and choice. And I think you can create moments where you can think about the relevant application, even when you have a lot of hard skill content to get through. Okay, everyone. We're up against time. Thank you so much for the questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. You're welcome to come back. We're going to do this again in just a few hours' time. So, but you know where to find me. I'm with Hull TF there. You can find me on LinkedIn at CP McCormick, I think is my URL there. But I would love to hear more from you about what you think. And of course, do take time to get to know what we do, because we are very much focused on this new world of work. These are the kinds of topics that we engage with organizations to help shore up their strategies for professional development. So it's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day wherever you are. Thanks all.